Welcome to Helping Organizations Thrive. Today I have the pleasure of Alison Petty on the show. Good morning to you and welcome, Alison.
Hello, hi, lovely to be here.
Yeah, it's great to see you. It's been a while since we
Yeah.
set up this conversation, but we're here today. You are a mindset coach and an inspirational speaker with a focus on resilience and transformational coaching. And today we're going to be exploring, and this is where the inspirational comes from, your story from being in a wheelchair to rock climbing and ultimately becoming a mindset coach. But before we go there, Alison, I'd like to ask, what do you love about what you do?
Well, two things, if that's okay. I can have two things. The big one is the change in the clients that I see. So that's the exciting part for me. It's nourishing for me. Every session I've ever come away from, I feel good, even if that person started out in a really dark, difficult place. But because of that change that I see in them during the session, I always come away feeling uplifted as well. And then, as listeners will find out, my why, I really walked the walk. Now I talk the talk, and I get to now pay it forward and help other people because of my history. So yeah, it's if I'd have gone off and just lived my life in a very different way, that would have been awesome. But for me, it's like I get to now put that time to some really good use. So yeah, those are my reasons.
Fantastic. And let's explore that why. And I'd like us to take us back really to that moment when you received a diagnosis that basically puts you in a wheelchair at the age of 17. And almost what was the impact and the outlook at that time on your life?
I mean, gosh, very long time ago as well now. It was 1992. I didn't get the diagnosis for a couple of years because it took a long time then because I think it still does now, but not as long now. But I became ill at 17 due to a very nasty flu virus that I'd had maybe about 6 months before. I think my immune system was just compromised by that. And then I smoked cannabis, as a lot of young teenagers do, and tried that for the first time. And unfortunately for me, I had a really, really, really nasty reaction to it. And I think between the two things, my body, my immune system just completely just shut down. And it was literally overnight. This is a very, very long story, very short. And I was just chronically ill. And it was almost like that. One day I was a very healthy kid, started my A-levels, with a dream, as we were just talking about, becoming a rock climbing instructor and living in the Canadian Rockies by now, my kayak and my dog. And literally the next day I wasn't going back to school. Well, we knew that for the foreseeable future, but it was, I think it was about 9-10 months before I was able to go back into college at a very, very, very reduced level. And then the next 24 years were an absolute mishmash of chronic illness and chronic bone, joint, muscle pain, extreme fatigue. And I mean extreme where making a cup of tea feels like climbing a mountain, and I now know what it is to climb a mountain. Extreme cognitive fatigue, very intense light and sound sensitivity. I couldn't have sat anywhere near this beautiful bright window, had this conversation. And over the next 24 years, there were times where I could do things, but anything that I did always, and I mean, in NLP, if somebody says always, we're like always, but this is like the one always, because usually it's like, oh, actually, maybe there was that time. I can never think of a time when I did something as 24 years that didn't result at some point, and usually quite quickly, in a flare up of symptoms, which would often result in sometimes relapses that would last for obviously days, but weeks, months, and then years. And there was an 8-year relapse in my 20s to 30s. So that was the time. But when I could do things, I could function, but quite often I was in a wheelchair. And then years of being, pretty much bed and housebound, being in a dark room. So it was a mix of things. It wasn't just, I wasn't just solidly in a wheelchair for 24 years. But every time I did something, it was like, one step forward, 20 back, that kind of.
My goodness, I mean that sounds obviously really tough, tough on the body, but tough on the mind. Take us back to that point when you were 17. When you're 17, the life's all for taking, isn't it? And you've got lots of energy, you're optimistic, you're hopeful, and suddenly you're stopped in your tracks by this sort of physical, impact on your body. And how did you deal with that at the time, from a mindset point of view?
I think at the time, you just deal with it, don't you? When something happens, and I was very young, up until that day, you know, I'd had some challenges, like, you know, nothing crazy, nothing terrible until then. I mean, it's almost like the most heartbreaking moment I had was when I think I must have been about 16, and I was obsessed with sport. When I was 14, I went to an outdoor pursuit summer camp in South Wales, down the road from where I live in North Wales. And I fell in love there with rock climbing and not mountain biking, abseiling and kayaking and all those things. And that was when I was like, I want to grow up and be a rock climbing instructor. I also fell in love with one of the instructors. That was my first human love, as I always say. But yeah, and I was obsessed with sport at school as well. And one day I fell over. I think I fell over in the bath, but I hit my knee, and it just brought to the attention the fact that I had something called Osgood-Schlatter's disease, which is hereditary. My brother had it. My cousin had it, and I was told by the doctor that I had to stop sport 100%. Wasn't be able to do sport. No more sport at all in any way, shape, or form. And that was almost the most heartbreaking moment of my life. But other than that, you know, until I was 17 and then got this diagnosis or became ill, yeah, you just deal with it. You just go through it. I mean, when I look back on it now, incredibly dark time. I was really scared, you know, really scared. And I think what I now know about how I got ill, and we'll come to that, that fear, that terror about the whole thing, you know, because it really was. I'd had this dream of, you know, being this very, very adventure-packed life, and being an instructor in outdoors and living my life in the mountains. And suddenly, you know, I was in chronic head-to-toe pain. Even my eyelashes hurt. I remember, you know, I touched my eyelashes and they'd be raw. I now understand what was going on, but at the time we just didn't have a single clue. I was also having this reaction to the cannabis, which was ongoing for a couple of years. So we were dealing with that and trying to figure that out, which we couldn't until it eventually just disappeared into the depths of everything else that was going on. But at the time, you know, what's ME and fibromyalgia, which was the diagnosis that I was given, essentially you're tested for everything, and there's no definitive blood test, or there wasn't at that time. I'm not sure now if there is, but see, now I deal with this stuff in a very different way, and that's how I got well, was a very different way to medication. But if you presented with all these symptoms of chronic pain, you know, muscle, bone, joint pain, and the fatigue and the sensitivities, you know, but everything else on my blood test was coming back normal. I think in 24 years, all I can remember, many tests over the years, they all came back, you know, you're healthy, but here's some morphine. You know, it's like those two things just never added up. And maybe, you know, I would have had some vitamin deficiency or something, you know, but nothing major, you know, just a little bit, like maybe a B vitamin or something. And that was it. So very demoralizing. And back then, especially now, you know, the lack of belief by society, and not everyone in the medical profession, but, you know, there was that big lack of belief because there wasn't that definitive blood test. That was very demoralizing as well. And my mum would sit with me in the doctor's surgery endlessly saying, this girl is not depressed. You know, that's not what this is. You know, and again, up until that moment, I was, you know, one of the most active, healthy teenagers out there. So yeah, something had clearly happened, but we couldn't, you know, nobody knew why or what. So you end up in this loop of having the label of the diagnosis, which, you know, as you know, language is everything, incredibly impacting. And then just this hopelessness kind of, you know, we were trying everything over the years that we could access at the different times, you know, from all the different medications, and then, you know, the pain relief things like morphine and codeine, Valium, and different times over the years. They all made me feel worse, to be honest, you know, like they might alleviate it for a moment, but side effects and all of that good stuff. And then all the alternative things over the years that, again, we could access, from nutrition to Reiki to healing, or anything. But for me, nothing touched it. For other people, you know, we're all different. Things work for different.
And how did you, and obviously you had that for 2 decades of your life, which is a long time. How did you just keep going with going back to the doctors, doing daily tasks, which sounded quite difficult? Yeah. How did you keep going? What was keeping you going?
I think my family, you know, my mum and my dad, my brother, his partner cousin, and then my niece when she came along was everything, and my friends. I mean, I was very, very lucky. I started an organization online way before Facebook and all of that in 2000. to serve as an online community for people that were going through the similar thing that I was going through. But it was very specifically to provide a place where we could relax and have fun and just be, rather than a sort of a medical or an advocacy one. So I knew a lot of people, thousands of people joined it over the years. And I was always very conscious that I was in a very fortunate position to have family around me and friends who believed me and supported me. And a lot of people out there don't have that. And I cannot, when I think about that, when I was aware of that at the time, that was unimaginable. So again, people will say to me, I don't know how, I couldn't have, how did you possibly? It's like, well, if you were in that position, you would have, because you have to, it's like, you just keep going and you just keep trying. And I think that for me was absolutely the foundation, perhaps my mindset as well. But I definitely went through dark times of depression, and because if you're that ill, you are going to experience huge struggles with your sort of ways of thinking. I remember the last relapse I had was 2012 to 2016, literally to the day that I did the lightning process, which is what got me well, being pretty much in a dark room. And when you can't just go for a walk or a run or watch TV, your brain starts to go a little crazy, and having to deal with those kind of things, it was like tiny things that wouldn't even factor on my radar nowadays became like dragons, like monsters. And mindfulness helped me quiet and all of that, while I was lying in bed in a dark room. So, but again, you just, you keep going and you keep looking, and I'm not, as the years went on, it became harder to see how there was going to be anything that was going to, because when you try everything, and it's just not negatively, or pessimistically, it's just like that light gets further and further away, at the end of that long dark tunnel.
And before you all sort of changed, would you say at that point of your life, when you look back on those 20 years or so, would you say you were a resilient person? And be interesting, what would be your definition of resilience at that point?
At that point, I mean, it's interesting to think back. Was I resilient then? I think I must have been, but again, I wasn't. I was just, living and just getting through. I can remember. I can just remember such dark times, but also the good times. And for me, there wasn't an alternative. There wasn't an alternative. And even the moment when I had my sort of magical moment of realizing the lightning process was the thing that I hadn't done, my brain, I was standing in my room. I'd just come back from the bathroom. This was in 2016. And I was just about to get back into bed for the end of the time. And I heard my brain say, I'm done. And it wasn't like, I'm going to end my life kind of done, but it wasn't, I am done. What have I not tried? What have I missed, in that moment? And I remember that moment so clearly, and I must have had that thought over the years, but not in that way, or that one was just so big. And that was when I was like, that was the thing. There's something.
So is this your brain basically? We've almost exhausted everything. I just can't do any more on this and cope with it.
I cannot keep doing this. I mean, I was going to have to, if I'd not then next had that thought of the lightning process, I'd have got back into bed and, carried on. You don't know how those things would have worked out, do you? All I know is that was that defining moment. But I must have had times over the years, when, I don't remember ever having that where I sort of hit my limit. But, I just got very lucky. The next thought was, lightning process, that's it. Let's try that. And then bam, everything changed, to the complete opposite degree.
So your brain got to a point of, I'm done. And that created for you almost a sort of doorway into something new, didn't it? Because it started, you made perhaps think, is there something else I've not tried? And often, I think sometimes we in life get into those positions where we feel like we've tried everything to try and get through a scenario, and actually just stepping back a little bit and just actually look for the wisdom, even in the things that have not gone so well, haven't they, to try and help navigate and understand and reflect on it and think differently and different perspectives. So take us through that point then, when you then got that moment of, there's something I've not tried. What
Well,
happened then?
the beautiful thing about it as well, because I was just talking about the mindfulness. So I'd over those 4 years, but particularly the so to say maybe 2012 to 16, you know, in the sort of second half of that 4-year relapse, when those dragons were huge, I just realized that I had Eckhart Tolle and Thich Nhat Hanh. They're two. Eckhart Tolle wrote The Power of Now, who's it's all about being present, and then Thich Nhat Hanh is a Vietnamese Buddhist monk who's beautiful. They're two of the most beautiful beings on the planet. And I remember that I had hours and hours of audio, so I would listen to them for hours because they were very peaceful, very gentle. And I developed this mindfulness practice over that couple of years, to the point where I was peeing mindfully, like everything, you know, was mindful. And it quietened all of that craziness in my brain to almost nothing. And that was an incredible experience, which I'm very grateful to have had, because I learned the power of mindfulness and, you know, what it can achieve. And then I was watching some stuff around that, and watching a guy on YouTube or something, and he was talking about neuroplasticity, and I didn't know, never heard of it. I had, but I hadn't tweaked it. And then he started explaining what it was, and I was like, oh, that's what I did. I quietened those crazy pathways basically to nothing. And I got so excited about that because I could see that link. And then when I was able to, if I could watch something on my laptop or podcasts, like everything neuroplasticity, completely fell in love with it. So for those listening, neuro to neural pathways that are firing and wiring in your brain all the time. Every time you're doing something or creating or talking. I always say, like, you know, when you were 5 and you learned to tie your shoelace for the first time, you were busy firing little pathways in your brain as well that were creating connections. And, you know, for that first week, you'd be running out the door and tripping over that lace still, but you kept practicing it until the moment you ran out the door, said goodbye to your mum, got to school without having to go to A&E because you'd broken your ankle tripping over your lace. That's like fire, you know, your little neural pathways working away there. And then plasticity is how your brain is able to change. So that plasticity of your brain. And scientists used to think that our brains stopped changing in our late teens, but we now know that in your 90s, if you're still compos mentis and able to think new things, your brain is still changing. It might just be a little bit slower. So so I'd learned all about that, and I was just really passionate about it. And then when the lightning process hit my little brain, my brilliant brain, in that moment of what have I missed, I rang a practitioner almost straight away, and she said, I didn't know anything about it. I knew it was NLP. I didn't know anything about NLP. I'd heard those words. I'd gone down the CBT route. That hadn't worked.
Tell us what NLP is, because some people might know what NLP is.
Yeah, so again, N is your neuro pathways or neurons. L stands for linguistics, so it's neuro-linguistic programming. Start with that. So N is your neural pathways. L is linguistics, so that's your language. And anyone who knows anything about me, I'm banging on about that, power of that all the time. So not just that language that we're using when we're speaking to each other, and how impacting that can be in a good way and a bad way, but more importantly, that internal narrative that's always ticking away in our brain, and learning how to harness that to really create what I call our roadmap for our brain, that really solid foundation that sets our course, part of our life, you know, in the direction that we want it to go in, rather than that one that's on autopilot. And then P is programming. So I always talk about how, you know, our brain is essentially a computer, and we can program that computer and hardwire it with that version of reality that we want to have, again, rather than that autopilot version. So so I didn't know any of this at the time. I just heard the 3 letters NLP, like you hear CBT, and didn't know what that was. And she said to me, you know, well, do you know what neuroplasticity is? And in that split second, I have many moments that are like absolute, like so ingrained in me and give me goosebumps. But before she'd almost finished the word plasticity, my mouth opened and I said, I'm in. That was all I needed to know. And I get really emotional. I can feel it in my throat, because it was just such a turning point for me. And I was lying in bed in the dark, being propped up, having this call with this woman who I didn't know. And just, I didn't even know really anything more. And I just said, I'm in. And I was on a course 2 weeks later, was taken in a wheelchair, you know, dark glasses under a blanket. Didn't, again, really know much about it. You know, I was told just come and just do it. You know, you're basically taught a technique that you have to go away and do over and over and over again, like tying those shoelaces. You know, you don't say, you know, you don't learn Spanish in a day, you have to practice and practice. And that's where you get change. And I 1,000% know if I'd have gone, learned the technique, done it a few times, and then gone, nah, I would still be in that dark room, because in the 24 years of trying, I don't even know how many things, but as many things as we could access, and there was many. Me, nothing touched it, not even touched it. And on that first day of that course, I was brought back home, and I can't put my finger on it. And I always say it's here, if people are listening, just behind my head, I always point to this place here. There was an almost imperceptible shift. It was so tiny, but it was something was different for the first time in 24 years. And I knew myself well enough, and I knew the illness well enough to know something's there, something's different. And it was enough.
Was it a different in terms of a feeling, or was it a difference in terms of a mindset? What happened?
I literally couldn't tell you. And it was so, you know, it was, you know, almost microscopic. It was just a knowing that something felt different, and all that was enough to be like, keep doing this thing, you do it, you know. And I just every day for, you know, 10, 20, 30 times a day, this technique basically, and I'll explain very briefly what it enables in the body, because with the lightning process, you're not going away. You're not taught to think yourself better. So you're not, you know, I am well. It's not affirmations. It's not that kind of thing. You know, and it wasn't that I just decided that now I'm going to be well and I'm going to have a positive mindset and life is awesome. You know, it's not that at all. And I think
the whole thing of power of positive thinking, which is helpful, but
yeah,
it doesn't mean you can overcome things by just thinking positive about things, is it? It really isn't about that.
And I think this particular technique, light process, and other similar ones, can have that misconception that you are just thinking yourself better, and therefore I'd be thinking myself unwell. And that's very much not the case. And again, going back to that this misunderstanding of the illness, and they're just depressed or opting out, the yuppie flu from in the 80s of high-flying professionals burning out and all that kind of stuff. So basically, you're taught a particular technique, and this technique enables you to switch off the fight or flight response. Now, I'm very excited because I'm about to train to be a practitioner of this. So the guy who created the lightning process is a brilliant guy called Dr. Phil Parker, who created it, I guess, around 25 years ago now, when the work he was doing with people presenting with what I was doing, that kind of those symptoms. He suddenly, over time, found this, it was having an impact, what he was doing, and he just developed this training program, which is called the lightning process. To become a trainer, you have to do all of the clinical training with him. So last year I did my year of clinical training. So, you know, I'm now an advanced master practitioner of NLP coaching, hypnotherapy with him. And after that, you can then go on and be a practitioner of the lightning process, which I'm about to do. So I've been learning about actually what happened, because I came away from the course in 2016, you know, doing this thing, falling in love with NLP, neuroplasticity, researching everything, because I just, from the very first day of being on that course, it's a 3-day training program, I was never in a wheelchair again. But the most
this had a massive impact in terms of physically and all the symptoms, everything was just disappearing, basically.
Yeah, basically, I was never in a wheelchair again. But more importantly, I never relapsed again. That's the really important part. So I would say over the course of about 8 months, I just went from, you know, I wasn't rock climbing the next day. That would have been insane, or even a couple of months later. But it, rather than that 1 step forward, 20 back, it was 1 step forward, 2 steps forward, 3 steps forward. You know, I'm trying to I'm doing a thing with my hands, but I know for people that are listening, it's kind of hard to explain. But I just, every single day, I just got better and better and better and better over the months. And it was just wild to do something and not experience any symptoms or a flare up. So I was still unwell. You know, it was just a gradual increase of health over that time, that sort of upward curve. I just never did something and then flare up, you know, and that was, when I say wild, it was wild. I remember having a panic attack because I couldn't believe it in Brighton a few weeks later, where I was like, how, and I had to ring my practitioner and say, I was, you know, really like, this is insane. And she,
well, it is really, because you've had 20 years or so of being this identity, because it becomes an identity, doesn't it? this being in a wheelchair, being ill, being in pain, suffering, and it's sometimes hard to get out of that mindset of that shift, isn't it? Because you're suddenly going, well, I'm not supposed to be like this because I've had 20 years of this, half my life, basically, more than half your life at that point, would have been literally, that's your identity. That's what you've been known for. People seeing doctors, people would have been saying that over you, labeling you that and all that. And now suddenly you're walking around, not relapsing, starting to feel better, which must be freaking you out, to be honest, at that time.
Yeah, it was an actual panic attack. And my practitioner said, do the lightning process now on that, because basically it's not just for ME fibromyalgia, it's essentially for, it's cool because I don't really have any, my niche as a coach is humans who are stuck. I don't work with a certain area or a certain type of person. It's like, if you're stuck, or it sort of breaks down a little bit more than that, but it's for that. And in that moment I was stuck, and it moves you forward essentially. But what it does, because I like to be very clear about this, it switches off the fight or flight response, or enables you to switch off the fight or flight response. So there is a physiological thing going on in the body that's out of whack, if you like, but it's something that the medical tests don't pick up. So all those medical tests, we knew they must be right because I had so many of them. It wasn't like one or two that were wrong. But suddenly I found myself, they were right. I am okay, but there was something wrong with me. So basically, in the days of our prehistoric ancestors, that fight or flight, saved us from the tiger, which is why we are all here now, which is great. But that fight or flight would then switch off and they go back to the campfire, and that was awesome. Nowadays, unless you're Yoda, like everyone's in some kind of state of fight or flight to some degree or another. And when it's out of whack, it's like for me, when I was 17, I had this flu virus and then this really nasty reaction to cannabis, and my body, I remember it very clearly, my body literally just shut down overnight. And then that extreme chronic symptoms, the muscle, bone, joint pain. I always say it's like, if you had flu, you had flu, or COVID, or
I had COVID a few years ago. Yeah.
Do you have the aching joints and muscles?
No, I didn't get to that, fortunately. No.
I don't know that. Okay, so whoever's listening, that aching. I used to say when it was really bad, it felt like my bones are being pressed in a vice. It's like really, oh God, that makes me emotional just thinking about that. And I haven't had COVID to my knowledge, but I did have a cold or something. Oh no, that's right. It was the COVID, the vaccine. And I had the after effects of that. And I was on the phone to my mum and I was, this is terrible. This is awful. And I was like, this is like it was for all those years. And she's like, yeah, you dealt with this for 24 years. And I was like, God, but I was so used to it. Now I'm like, like I fall apart for a couple of days and then it's gone. But that was just like, oh my God, how did I do that for all those years? But again, you just do because you don't have the choice. It's the way it is. So basically, so the fight or flight, when we get into some sort of state of it for whatever reason, and that was my version, we start to produce this sort of, this constant load of adrenaline, cortisol, all this, onto our system. And when it doesn't switch off, it causes something called an allostatic load. So this is a medical thing. This is not all in the mind. But basically that load, our bodies aren't built to withstand that load. And what happens is we end up with these sort of inflammatory issues in our body that lead to that, inevitable diagnosis of something like ME or fibromyalgia or long COVID. It's like, now it's the lightning process is being amazing for long COVID. I mean, I'm yet to be able to train people to do it, but I know friends of mine who are trainers doing amazing work with long COVID. So when you switch off the fight or flight, which the technique allows you to do, you have to do it over and over again. Essentially what happens is, you take that load, reduce it off your system, and the body's like, oh, okay, I can breathe again. Okay, I can work again normally because I'm not dealing with this,
So this is not, because obviously you talked about that analogy of tying your shoelaces and training yourself and sort of creating new neural pathways. This is not like you do a process and then it's done and dusted. You've got to keep sort of persisting with this and effectively retraining your brain and reprogramming. And that's what we're talking here, because I think some people have that thing. It's just you went to a session, they did some NLP and about lightning process, and you were all sorted. Actually, you had to go away and put some work in.
Oh man, yeah.
And really create new narratives, new neural pathways that would then help you sort of reduce this fight or flight sort of response that your body was doing for 24 years of your life. I guess, is that what we're saying? Yeah.
I always say it's the hardest work I ever did, but it's the best work I ever did. And I do get so emotional.
And can you share? I mean, obviously, I'm just conscious of time and obviously trying to explain things. Any that part of that process, how that might be sort of worked through with somebody, how would they might, if you interact with somebody, what sort of things might you say or do? I don't know. Is it easy to sort of conceptualize it in that way?
So, the
lightning process?
No, it's. I mean, it's NLP based. You know, you're taught a very particular kind of technique, but it's something that you have to go and train, because it's like a 3-day training program. But it is NLP based. And I mean, just go back to what you said just before about, you know, having to go away and do it. It's very clear, and I'm starting to do the train now. And one of the things is you have to be very clear with the people that you're training that once they're taught it, you know, with our support, you go away and you do it. And as I think I said earlier, you know, if I'd have done it for a couple of weeks and gone, yeah, it's kind of something, but it's not enough, you know, nothing's really happening, I would still be in that. We wouldn't be having this conversation now. I think knowing everything that I did try and being so maxed out, strong chance I wouldn't be sat here now doing what I'm doing now. But, you know, the NLP that I do with my clients, do work with chronic pain and, you know, phobias, you know, phobia with NLP. I had a lady at the end of 40 minutes couldn't remember what the phobia was she'd had at the start of the session, and that's NLP, and that was a really severe phobia, and she was sat there going, wait, what was the thing, what was that, you know? So NLP can be like, you know, absolutely transformational in that moment. But something like the kind of chronic illness I had, you know, 24 years of, you know, like if you think about that sort of that spaghetti junction kind of pathways, or those super highways in America, you know, that's how I see them. Really hardwired, crazy pathways. That's going to take, you know, a lot of work to quieten them right down to some nice little like single track country road down in Cornwall. You know, it's like the super right. But you know, I did it, and as I say, hardest work I ever did, but the best. And to be honest, from that first day when I noticed that thing that I can't describe, it was so much fun. You know, I fell in love with NLP and the power of my brain, which is now all I bang on about. But it was like, oh my God, I have this power, these choices. And NLP, the lightning process, what I talk about, you know, is like this choice, you know, the super skill we humans have of choice. And we, until we learn it, or you know, I wish this stuff was taught in schools, not necessarily under the name NLP, but like language and how impacting it is. But until we realize we have this, you know, that we're never as stuck as we think we are, ever.
No, and it's interesting because obviously I'm an NLP practitioner as well, and understanding the power of words and what they can do in terms of, you know, unlocking or making people stuck in many ways. And when I work with my clients, sometimes I feel I'm saying something really obvious to them, but it's not obvious because they don't know it, and that's fine. Because I'm in that world now. I sometimes think, am I just stating the obvious here, that they keep repeating a narrative, you keep repeating the same narrative, then you will fulfill that narrative because you get what you focus on, everything else, all that sort of stuff. And so it's important, isn't it, to actually, I think, I mean, there's a lot more, I suppose, I know my daughters read a lot more books on this from a personal development aspect. So I think it's more known about, you know, things like language and self-talk and narratives and what we, you know, we create, the narrative we create, will create our life and the actions we do and everything else. And I think there's more of it, but I agree with you. Having this taught in some shape or form in schools would be brilliant, actually, because it would really unlock people's. They may still need help at some point and everything else, as we all do, but actually, it will do a lot more for the young people in terms of what they do in their careers, why they do things, everything.
Yeah, I mean, you know, for us, we'd have a lot less clients, but I would prefer that. I'd prefer people who know this stuff. You know, we're humans, so there's always stuff to be dealt with. But, you know, especially teenagers, I mean, but yeah, the clients I have, you know, in their 60s, 70s, and you just think, you know, how different their life would have been. I mean, you know, I learned very quickly about the language, and I remember probably in the first couple of weeks standing in the hallway doing this technique on pain. And I suddenly realized, you know, pain for me was like a skyscraper above me. And I was like, oh, I don't want to say pain anymore. That has a massive impact on my physical body. Like when I say it, it doesn't now, I can say it and it, I don't know, flicker, you know, cells are like, but I changed the word to stuff. And when I would use, you know, with my family and friends, because they still needed to know, because it wasn't immediate, you know, it took a while before I was well enough to go out and live. And then I started rock climbing. We haven't talked about that, but I started rock climbing like, you know, the year after, and you know, that was it. 6 years of climbing and hill walking and all that kind of stuff. But there was a period of time where I was getting well, where I needed to still be able to communicate it, but I didn't want to say, okay, the pain's not good today, because that neurology would go, oh, okay, we're going back there again, and we're nowhere near getting out of this yet. So I'd use the word stuff, and I'd say to my mom and my dad and my family, like, you know, if I'm not good, I'm just going to say the word stuff, like stuff's not good today. And when I'd say that, my body there was no recognition. My family would keep a little lookout for me. You know, they wouldn't be like, oh, you okay? Because they knew about all of this. We would talk, you know, I explained it all, and they were amazing, and my friends too. And they would just keep that little eye out, or they just know that I was just, you know. And so I could just sneakily, you know, go through this time, and my brain was like, didn't know any different. And, and then eventually it was like,
you're foxing your brain a little bit by mentioning stuff, so it doesn't get so, okay, that's okay, it's just stuff, isn't it? No big deal.
Stuff means nothing. It's like, what's the most, you know, or
but this is it's so you know, language is so important, and what we say and how we say it in our brains, and so sensitive, isn't it, our brains to this. And I think it's been really wise, and obviously you realized by mentioning the word pain that created a bit of a reaction, and actually just shifting. But it's knowing that, isn't it? And this is where I guess from being you know, as a coach, we can help clients in that way, because we can help spot that things for them and help them empower them, because it's all about empowering people. Coaching is all about empowering people to be self-sufficient, sustainable for themselves. So you obviously went through this process, 24 years in pain, wheelchair. You went through a process that then you worked on yourself, and then now you're rock climbing, and then you become a coach. What was the impetus then to then become a coach? Because obviously, you know, I get the, you know, new life back to what you like to be, rock climbing and everything else, but why coaching? What was the last few minutes of our conversation? What was the why behind that?
This is the other emotional where I get like, oh God, I remember this moment so clearly. So I absolutely know that coaching, from the second I went on the Lightning Process course, coaching was waiting for me. Like, it was like, right, now you're going to get well now go off, have your life, go and figure out who you are, because I was 41 when I got well, and go and experience the world. So go have some fun. I did that and got a job working for the Youth Hostel Association in Llanberis. North Wales was always where I wanted to live. You know, Canada was like the ultimate retirement one day thing, but North Wales is my spiritual home. So I made a beeline for here, bought a van, which my dad converted into a beautiful camper van. Lived in that for a couple of years before lockdown. Climbed just like, oh, I could climb. And I climbed and climbed and climbed. Some mornings I would make, 40 bunk beds, on my own, after making 40 breakfasts for kids at 6 a.m. Then I'd rock climb in the afternoon, then 40 dinners in the evening, summer holidays, day after day. Just lived, and the world opened up for me. And then obviously lockdown happened. We had a particularly difficult, challenging, unfamiliar, as I say in NLP, lockdown, my father passing away in the very early lockdown, before vaccines. And that was very, very dark time. And I said to my mum, not so long ago, I'd rather have those 24 years back than the 2 years from the moment he passed, because it was immensely, immensely difficult. And other things happened on top. And I also didn't really have a home because I'd been living in a van, and massive, massive grief, depression, and difficult stuff. But in that moment, in that time, I think it was the first winter of the lockdown. Friends were taking me in and looking after me, and I very dark depression time, and end of a bottle of wine, which really you depressed, but it was that time. My friend and I were sitting on his couch and talking about life, and it's like, what am I doing in my life? And it was that question that so many people were asking during lockdowns in different ways for different reasons. And for me, it was like, what am I doing? I love the YHA and the youth hostels, but I've got, I don't know how long I've got now, because we don't know how long we've got. Hopefully I'll be around till I'm in my 90s and still climbing or coaching, and maybe not climbing, but coaching. And I asked that question, and my brain literally just went, this is when you do that thing. Like, it wasn't like, oh, coaching could be fun. I like neuroplasticity. That could be good. It was like, this is when this happens. And I, again, get proper choked up because it was like such a light in such a dark time. And the next morning I woke up. I hadn't been getting out of bed till 2 o'clock most days, if you know that, and really, really deep grief. But I woke up, opened my laptop. I already had my domain, but I started my name, and just started building my website, and that was it. And it just gave me purpose. It was about 8 months because I'd committed to finishing my old job at the youth hostel when we opened up. So I did that, and I was doing 60-hour weeks. So the actual business didn't really get off the ground properly until October, where I went full time. And then that's when I went to the clinical training with Phil. But it was, it's purpose. I get out of bed every day. It's not a job for me. It's absolute purpose. I get to pay it forward, and if I'd have gone on and carried on working with the YHA or something else, that would have been awesome. Like, just gone and lived my life. I'd still be talking about this in Tesco queues, which I was doing for 5 years before, that moment. I'd have many conversations in random places, singing the praises of Phil Parker and the lightning process. But now I get to do things like this, and then also coach clients and enable them to create the change that they're seeking to make in their life, for whatever reason, why ever they're stuck. So yeah, it was like, this is when that happens. It'd been waiting, there's no two ways around it.
That's fantastic, Alison, and it's been great talking to you, and it's lovely to hear the story, and it is an incredible transformational story, but something that you put a lot of work into this. It's not about just somebody's done click the switch and that's it. You've got to work at this, but you've discovered something, the power of the mind and creating new neural pathways, and I think that's really quite powerful. And it's powerful in all shapes and sizes of people, whether in sports or in business or just general life. What you and I do is transformational to people's how they go about their daily living, and but also makes them more enjoy life as well with it. So that's really good. I really appreciate you sharing today. Very candid, and yeah, it's been really interesting, very inspirational as well. So I'm sure people will find it inspirational. If people want to connect with you and get in touch with you, what's the best way of doing that?
My website would be the place. So it's Alison with one L, and then Petty, as in Mr. Tom Petty, my favorite singer of all time. Sorry, 2 T's, Petty, Petty. And yeah, I always say, if anyone's interested just to have or would like to just have a conversation about the health transformation, perhaps they're going through something or they know somebody, they're not interested in coaching, but they just would like to find out more. Half of what I do is coaching, the other half is telling the story and talking about it. So I would, what I would give to have had the conversation with me, 10 years into my illness. I always think, 24 years it's for what I do now. It's a good number to be able to go out and tell an inspirational story, create them. It's an impactful amount of time. I always think to the universe, I'm like, I think 10 years still would have been a good amount of time. I still could have told a good story and done what I'm doing. But yeah, so if anyone wants to just have a chat, with no obligation for anything else, please do get in touch. You can book that through my website. There's a booking page. But also for coaching, it's, I always offer free discovery calls. Just want to chat about how the work I do can enable awesome transformations in your life. But yeah, everything's on there, AlisonPetty.com.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alison, for your time today.
Oh, thank you, Julia. This has been awesome. I loved it. And it's a real honor to you to have asked me to be on this. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.